So another text tradition that is closely related to this um, is in the is the Sibylline oracles, which I've been reading through recently. I'm about maybe halfway through, and
Which we thank you for reading those because
those are really
they're
good.
really long and
They're
there's a
they can
lot of
be
them.
they can be tedious sometimes, but there's some real nuggets in there. So just to say, uh, usually we associate, maybe if you're a student of like mythology and folklore, you might associate the Sibyl with Rome, which is not incorrect, but actually in the ancient world there were like a bunch of different Sibyls.
Maybe tell people what a sibyl is because a lot of
Yeah,
people will not know what that is.
a Sibyl is it's a female oracle. Basically, it's a female prophet, a seer, somebody who's been given access by the divine to sort of know the future, to see the pattern manifesting itself in reality. And so actually your video on the apocalypse, the beast of the apocalypse, came at a really good time because it came out just as I was getting into the Sibylline oracles. And something that's really key in there is, of course, scholars have gone through there and they said, well, this verse sounds like paganism, so this verse was written by a pagan, but then this verse is clearly, supposed to mention, refers to Christ, and so this verse had to have been written by a Christian. And then they come across a verse that says, well, this verse references vaguely Judeo-Christian moral values, but it doesn't explicitly mention Christ, so that one must have been written by a Jew. And they dissect it like this,
Man, you know
and
why I hate scholars so much?
I know. I apologize on behalf of my
It's
tribe. I
okay.
really do. But I mean, like, it can be a little maddening
Yeah.
to kind of like try to trace that down. But if you just take all of that source criticism and you just set it to one side and you read the whole thing, it is actually, especially if you're familiar with any other ancient medieval literature, deeply cohesive.
Hmm.
And one of the things that's interesting in there, you said in your video on the Beast of Revelation that prophecies, the way prophecies work, they don't just refer to the one event at a certain point in time. Otherwise, once that event was passed, nobody would read them anymore, right? But rather, it's almost because there's this fractal structure to reality, that prophecies, you can see, they deal with the patterns, and even if the accidents change, the patterns manifest themselves over and over again. And you see that in the Sibylline oracles. So for instance, when they're dealing with judgment against a certain people, they'll pick two historical events that we would know, like, in a chronological sense, happened 500 years apart, but they both happen to the same Greek city, or they
Hmm.
both happen to Rome, right? And so the Sibylline oracles, which probably do come together as sort of, you know probably a hodgepodge of different sources, because you know even if you believe what the ancients believed, there are many different Sibyls and they're writing at different times, and at some point somebody could collected these prophecies together. And of course, the first and the most important Sibyl, you'll like this, is Noah's daughter-in-law.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it all goes back to Noah.
Huh.
And in fact, in the first, it's either the first or the second Sibylline oracle, there is this passage where it drops out of prophecy because it's describing the flood.
Hmm.
It drops out of prophecy and it just starts describing, here's what happened in the flood. And it's this deeply realistic firsthand account of Noah opening the door of the ark, and what, or the window of the ark, and looking out on the sea and what he saw and how
Mhm.
he felt and the color his face turned. And just the, like, all this stuff, like, it's this deeply, actually, I mean, it felt like something Tolkien could have written about the downfall of Numenor. In fact,
Hmm.
some of the language was so close that it made me like kind of raise an eyebrow. But then you get to the end of that oracle, and the prophetess reveals herself in a riddle. And if you work out the riddle, she's the daughter-in-law of Noah, so she
Interesting.
was on the ark. So
And then,
again,
but
like you said,
you could even the existence of these symbols and the existence of the kind of strange what you could call mixture of the some pay more pagan symbols, some more Christian, some more Jewish, and how they're kind of brought together.
right.
On the one hand, you could say that this is syncretic, and it is, but out of that syncretism can be pulled a notion that whoever it is that pulled legends together thought that these could exist together,
Exactly.
like that they were living in the same world, that somehow the Hellenistic world and the Jewish world had a way to talk, had ways to talk to each other.
That's the thing. Whenever somebody starts to say such and such is syncretic, I'm always like, why is that an objection to you? Like, have you met people? Like, how else do we do things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's also about meaning. It's like understanding that what makes syncretism problematic is when it goes against the truth, right? When it moves against the truth, but when sometimes it points towards the truth. And so that's why some of the ancient myths have a little seed of understanding what Christ will ultimately reveal. And in those seeds, we can see something valuable. And for example, like we all know that every single culture in the world has a flood narrative. So we could say something like, oh, those stupid cultures, they just copied the Jewish story and it's all,
or the Jewish story copied
don't,
whatever.
Don't look at that. It's horrible. Or like you said, or that it's just the Jews, or you could see, no, there's definitely a common experience on which this is based, whether it's a common experience in terms of history, or if it's an actual, almost like a genetic or like human nature thing that we have in us that bubbles up no matter what you do, that it's almost like an imprinted memory on human nature. It doesn't matter how you look at it. That means that you can get nuggets from these other stories as well. And you can get a sense, like when you read Gilgamesh, there are some things about the ancient flood that actually shine brighter when you read the Gilgamesh story, because you're like, oh, they're doing it this way. And so you say, oh, so it's pointing to something that I hadn't noticed in the other texts.
Yeah, and maybe it's also worth kind of pointing out here. So the Sibylline oracles they're sort of part prophecy, part history, but the two things are so interwoven that you can't actually separate them.
Yeah.
And part of being able to understand the idea of a universal history is being able to also understand it in terms of apocalypse. Like these two things always go together. I mean, we've talked a lot about this particular volume from the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library, which I have a lot of on the shelf over here. So this connects two works. One is the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, and the other one is an Alexandrian World Chronicle. So the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius is basically like dealing with the whole idea of after the Roman Empire. Well, it's really sort of like dealing with the story of the rise of Islam, right? So after the Roman Empire has come, has Christianized, has established peace, why then are bad things happening? Didn't we like, to put it in Arthurian terms, like, didn't we find the Grail? Like, shouldn't things be good now? Like, what's going on? And then the Alexandrian World Chronicle is another work from roughly the same period that is basically just a very straightforward, blow-by-blow universal history of the world. In fact, if you want an easy introduction to a universal history, you could do a whole lot worse than the Alexandrian World Chronicle. But the fact that these two things were just included in the same volume is a wonderful sort of symbolism happens moment, because the two texts are not related in that they were from the same author, but they are of a piece, right? That ancient peoples understand. You have to understand history to understand apocalypse, and vice versa, right? Because the history is, here's the way that the pattern manifested itself before us. This is where we're from. This is how we fit into the story. But then the apocalypse is that same thing looking forward.
The way that I kind of see it, and I think that you pointing to the apocalypse and to the, let's say, legendary history, there's something about, so just in terms of experience. So you can imagine we have your moment, like the moment in which you live, and that moment is you have access to a certain granularity to that moment if you want to, right? You can kind of access the details of this moment, okay? But the more you go forward, and the further you go back in both directions,
yes,
the more you move towards pattern. Right? And that just will happen normally, because in order for you to remember things from a very long time ago, they have to synthesize into patterns. And in order for you to talk about something that hasn't happened yet, but that is following that pattern, then you also have to use images that are universal enough, for them to then find body in the future. And it's just like if I said something like, I'm going to die, right? I'm going to meet death one day. It's like I'm talking in patterns. I don't know how. I don't know, but I know because I understand the pattern of life that this is going to happen, and so I'm predicting it. But I'm not saying that I'm going to get this disease or that I'm going to be this age or So as you move towards the future, you move in patterns, and so that can help us understand why the legendary history, both the story in Genesis, why it's so patterned, and why it looks like the end of Revelation with the heavenly Jerusalem, and why the prophecies of Ezekiel are talk about paradise and the mountain of precious stones and all of this type of imagery, because it's both. Like there is this extreme in the past and the future of how you can actually see the pattern more easily when you look at things that are very far away in both directions, let's say. And so in the universal history, that's something that happened. And so one of the elements of the universal history is trying to trace all peoples back to Noah.
Right.
And the way that they would do it was almost like through ontology, through the characteristics of the people to a certain extent. So there would be like their place in the world geographically, but there would also be like an understanding of the characteristics of the people. So a good example that I like to use, which seems arbitrary, is that the Hungarians see themselves as descendants of Nimrod. And you think like, how could you ever prove that? You can't prove anything like that. Like this is obviously not, but there's something about so you can imagine when the Hungarians converted, then they tried to unite themselves with the biblical story, with the Christian story.
Right.
And then in their characteristics, they're like, oh, we're nomads, we're hunters, we live, this is how our ancestors lived. And therefore connecting it to Nimrod, who was this giant, as also because the Hungarians are kind of ogre-like, like even in their own, the way that they that's why the ogres are actually Hungarians, Like I think some people think that the word ogre comes from like a same root as Hungarian.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And so this idea that they have giant ancestors and that they were these hunters and everything. And so this is not even like people saying it about them.
Right.
Which is because there's a negative aspect to that. Like being a descendant of Nimrod is not like necessarily all positive. But it's like recognizing yourself and your place in the story, and then understanding that aspect can also be converted and participate in the, in the universal salvation.